Or 1 and 2.
See how it's like...
Now I hear it.
Wait, I hear it too. I see it now.
Whatever you
So now we have audio.
Stay there.
All I did was touch it, so I didn't even push a button. I had a colleague of mine that she needed to do something on computer, and she asked me to come into the office. She said, stand there. I said, okay. And she sent an email. She goes, okay, you can go now. She was convinced that my presence would threaten the computer enough to make it work. So whatever works. So Rachel, that one is for you. Continuing our journey through the Gospel of Mark. We've been kind of slow walking this, but I think it's been good to look at some specific passages as we've gone through. And we are approaching the halfway point in the story. Pretty much the moment where Jesus says, "Who do you say that I am?" marks the halfway point for the Gospel of Mark. That Jesus has basically gotten as far from Jerusalem as Jesus can get. And then it's at that point he asks, "So who do you say that I am?" And after that, the journey then starts toward Jerusalem. After that, Jesus starts talking about the cross that's coming and the resurrection that's coming, and the disciples misunderstand. So the story really turns on that. And so we're getting really close to that.
So there's many ways to measure halfway. You're saying halfway through geographically?
I'm saying halfway through narratively.
Narratively.
Yeah, halfway through narratively.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it happens to be the farthest.
It happens to be the furthest you can get from Jerusalem and still be in Israel. Yeah. So, but before we get there, Jesus and his disciples came to Bethsaida. Some people brought a blind man to Jesus and begged him to touch and heal him. Taking the blind man's hand, Jesus led him out of the village. After spitting on his eyes and laying his hands on the man, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" This is one of those great miracles. "Jesus, can you give me sight?" "Jesus, just a second."
That's not what you did.
You don't think so?
No. No, there's no moisture in the desert. He needed moisture. So
Bethsaida's not a desert. Bethsaida's got green grass and it's lush. It's in the Galilee.
No water nearby, so he just...
It's right.
spit on his...
You don't want him spitting on his eyes?
No.
Hey, I'm just reading the Bible, Bob. I don't know what to tell you here. It's just... But what is more significant to me than the manner of the healing is what comes next. The man looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees, only they're walking around." So this is a strange occurrence of a partial healing that we get. So the person is not fully healed at this point. Then Jesus placed his hands on the man's eyes again, looked with his eyes wide open, his sight was restored, and he could see everything clearly. And then Jesus sent him home saying, "Don't go into the village," which is an interesting way to finish that story. Couple of things working here. Remember what we're about to do. I was just about to tell you that we're about to have the "Who do you say that I am" passage. We're about to have Peter recognize Jesus as the Christ, and that's great, but we know from the very beginning of the book that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. In Mark, Peter does not confess that he is the Christ, the Son of God. He is the Christ. So we have a partial understanding of who Jesus is. And right before we get the partial understanding who Jesus is, we get a partial healing of the blind man. And I don't think that's accidental. I think that Mark is setting up this understanding of progress, of partial understanding, of multiple steps to getting where we want to go. So I can see people, they look like trees. How about now? Yeah, I can see everybody now. So just like Peter, you're the Christ. It'll take a while before Peter recognizes Jesus is the Son of God. I think the "don't go into the village" is carrying through that issue of the messianic secret, that don't go tell anybody who I am because they're not going to understand who I am until after the Messiah. So I think that the guy who's been blind and he walks back in and can see, that story's going to get out and people are going to misunderstand who Jesus is. I assume that's what's going on there. It is an odd way to say it, I will confess. So, how are we doing? All good? Well, we're already doing faster than we did at the men's retreat. Come on. So, Jesus and his disciples went into the villages near Caesarea Philippi. This is Caesarea Philippi way in the north. All right, this is one of the three main sources of the Jordan River, or one of the springs there. Very lush, beautiful, exotic animals. Some of them even a jungle. It's a nature preserve currently. Beautiful, beautiful area. Temple to Pan, the god Pan is there, and so over time that temple to the god Pan led through history and time. The name of it now is Banyos. The Pan and Banyos, you get the corruption over time of the language as it goes on. And
Greek god.
yeah, that's right, in the underworld. Right, so, and there's this beautiful, there's this huge cave where the temple was that, many people think of it as, people thought of it as the gates of hell, actually. So having this notion of, who do you say that I am? And in this area, asking this question in the site of this temple is contextually significant as you get to it. Anyway, on the way that he asked the disciples, who do people say that I am? They told him, some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, still others one of the prophets. So John the Baptist was already in the story, so those people haven't been paying very close attention. Elijah was the person who is going to precede the coming of the Messiah. So some are thinking that Jesus is making the way, the voice crying in the wilderness, right? He's that one. And others still some other prophet. He asked them, what about you? Who do you say that I am? Peter answered, you are the Christ. Well, good for Peter. He got that one at least halfway. He got that far. Bob, did you have a... No, you were just giving me visual feedback. Cool. But Jesus ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Then he began to teach his disciples, the human one must suffer many things and be rejected. I didn't go far enough. Rejected by the elders, chief priests, and legal experts, and be killed, and then after 3 days rise from the dead. He said this plainly, but Peter took hold of Jesus and, scolding him, began to correct him. Jesus turned and looked at his disciples and sternly corrected Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are not thinking God's thoughts, but human thoughts. So the day for Peter had its ups and downs. He's just been commended by Jesus, and now he's been called Satan. Not a particularly good day at that point. But obviously a misunderstanding of who, Peter is likely assuming Jesus is just being negative, right? Prophets get killed, absolutely. You're going to have your struggles, but no, Jesus, we're not going to let this happen. We've got your back. Have a Snickers. Eat something. You're just being grumpy. That's right. You're always like this when you're hungry, Jesus. I promise we'll make it. But it really is, on some level, Peter is defending Jesus, I think. Where Jesus is saying, I'm going to go there and they're going to crucify him. He's like, we're never going to let that happen. We are never going to, we have got your back.
Saying it with the best intentions. Jesus is like, don't dismiss what
Exactly. He really does mean well. And Jesus is saying, no, you are thinking like a human being. You are not thinking like God in this story.
That's not fair.
He is, in fact, a human being, so it's only natural. But in this case, thinking like a human being has set him absolutely against God because he is Satan. Now, this is one of those times when I don't think Peter is literally Satan. I think Peter is standing against God, which is Satan. Anything which stands against or opposite. The Hebrew word is to stand opposite. And so he is literally, this is not an M. Night Shyamalan kind of twist. And it turns out Peter is Satan. Nobody saw that coming. No, it's not. That's not it. It's just that he is acting against what God wishes. So, famous passage, and now everything starts moving toward Jerusalem. This is the first of our warnings about what's going to happen in Jerusalem. And so, we have 3 in the next 3 chapters. I mentioned that in a sermon a couple weeks ago. Chapter 8, chapter 9, chapter 10 all have these warnings of what's going to happen in Jerusalem. And all 3 times we get the disciples saying, you're just being negative. Just being negative. After calling the crowd together with his disciples, Jesus said to them, all who want to come after me must say no to themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. All who want to save their lives will lose them, but all who lose their lives because of me, because of the good news, will save them. Why would people gain the whole world but lose their lives? What will people give in exchange for their lives? Whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this unfaithful and sinful generation, the human one will be ashamed of that person when he comes into his Father's glory. Jesus continued, I assure you that some standing here won't die before they see God's kingdom arrive in power. So we get our first statement about what true service is, what true following is, and this call to embrace the cross. Remember, there are no padded crosses. Crosses come with scandal. Crosses come with public ridicule. The purpose of the cross, and it's hard for me to believe we have ever found a more cruel manner of execution than the cross. The purpose was to humiliate whoever is on the cross. Crucifixions were usually done just about, in the movies, they're always way up, the crosses are always really tall. But in real life, crosses, typically the person was maybe 3 feet off the ground. They were right there. They very often would line roadways. A lot of people got crucified by the Romans. Always political insurgents. Anybody the Romans wanted to shame. Anybody the Romans wanted to make an example of, to make sure that nobody would ever do what this person did. So to embrace the cross, it's hard to really think about how scandalous that would be to these first hearers. Taking up a cross is to run headlong towards I don't care what the people think. It's going to set me against public opinion. It's going to set me against the right way things are done. But because Jesus asked me to do it, I'm going to do it. It's a radical thing to say that would have broken their brains.
So now that you've reminded us what that really means, can we read that passage again with that in mind?
So all who come after me must say no to themselves, take up their cross and follow me. All who want to save their lives will lose them, but all who lose their lives because of me and because of the good news will save them. Why would people gain the whole world but lose their lives? And what will people exchange for their lives? Whoever is ashamed of me and my words is unfaithful in the sinful generation. The human one will be ashamed of that person when he comes in the Father's glory with his holy angels. Yeah. It's a self-emptying call to, this is Paul's, I've been crucified with Christ and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. Well, this is how Christ lives, putting himself below those that he is giving his life for. Yeah. Challenging words. Yeah, it's one of those things I've said many times. It's not that Jesus' way is hard to understand, and that's why people don't do it. It's hard. That's why people don't do it. We understand it perfectly. We just don't want to. That's the thing. That's the nature of it. 6 days later, Jesus took Peter, James, and John and brought them to the top of a very high mountain where they were alone. Now, if you ask the tourist industry, this very high mountain is Mount Tabor, which just happens to be right next to the pilgrim path that runs right through Israel, which is a great place in the 4th century if you were visiting Israel to stop off and worship on Mount Tabor to see the hill of the Transfiguration. Most likely, however, it was Mount Hermon, which is up by Caesarea Philippi and is nearer to where they were at this time. When, Caesarea Philippi and going up on a very high mountain, it's probably going to be Mount Hermon up in that area. But it wasn't convenient to sell tickets to, and so it wasn't a place that they built a church or built a monastery or anything. Not that I'm implying money's a motivating factor for people, but people haven't changed, okay? People have always been people, always. So anyway, 6 days later, Jesus took Peter, James, and John, brought them to the very top of a high mountain where they were alone. He was transformed in front of them, and his clothes were amazingly bright, brighter than if they'd been bleached white. Elijah and Moses appeared and were talking with Jesus. Peter reacted to all of this by saying to Jesus, "Rabbi, it's good that we're here. Let's make 3 shrines, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." He said this because he didn't know how to respond, for the 3 of them were terrified. I do love that sense of, I should probably say something. Cool day, isn't this cool? This is really cool. I should put a tent up for each of us. That would be awesome. Transfiguration is one of the weirdest things you get in the Gospels. It's only occurring in Matthew and Mark and Luke. The Transfiguration, the best way I can explain this is what we get is a glimpse of post-resurrection Jesus, but pre-crucifixion. In other words, this is a picture of Jesus in glory. And it is a reminder that what Jesus is doing, he is not doing because there was no choice. Jesus was not taken against his will. He did not lose. It was not a battle. Jesus is showing here, this is who I am, and I don't have to do this, but I am going to do this. Now, the reason you only find this in Matthew, Mark, and Luke is because in John, Jesus' transfiguration, Jesus is always glorified in John. Crucifixion is glorification in John, which is fast. John moves everything back a step. And crucifixion is glorification. So you don't get a transfiguration in John. But in the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you do get this moment of Jesus showing the disciples, this is who I am. And I should say, on a mountain, if Peter's wanting to build shrines for them, there's a very good chance they're celebrating Sukkot. Sukkoth, is it sometimes pronounced, S-U-C-C-O-T-H. It's the Jewish holiday, the Festival of Booths. And it remembers the wandering in the wilderness. And so for a week, the practice is to sleep in a tent outside. And even people in Israel on their balcony, they'll like multi-level apartment building, they have a balcony, they have a frame for a tabernacle, for a booth, for a tent outside that they will stay in that week to remember the wandering in the wilderness. So the very religious will do this. And so there's also, I'll tie all this together, in Zechariah, a vision of the end times is when all of, I believe it's in Zechariah, I forget the reference exactly, all of the nations of the world come to Israel and all the Gentile nations come and celebrate Sukkot, the Festival of Booths. So we've got Jesus transfigured, we got Elijah and Moses showing up. it happens to be that holiday, Peter's got to be thinking, this is it. We won. It's hooray! How about that? Happy ending, everybody. I'll build a tent for Moses and Elijah, and you too, Jesus, and it'll be great. And so he's got to be thinking, we've made it. We finally made it. And turns out he didn't.
What is it, the festival of what?
Sukkot, or booths, like a booth.
And meaning, again.
It just means it is a festival that remembers the wilderness wandering, the 40 years in the wilderness, the generation. It is a camping holiday. It's a camping holiday, yes. And
Do
so
they still have it? They still have
people will observe it. Yeah, no, not everybody. It depends on how
I just never
how
heard of
one
that
practices.
word,
And
and I thought
yeah,
it was a different
Sukkot.
Jewish holiday.
Yeah, it's in the fall. Actually, I think it was just a couple weeks ago. It's not long after Yom Kippur. It's connected in there. So, yep, remembers the wandering. So Peter decides to make conversation. I always. The cloud overshadowed them, and a voice spoke from the cloud. This is my son. So God knows the relationship that Jesus has, right? Peter just got so far as you are the Christ, but God knows who Jesus is, just like we do, because we read the first verse. Whom I dearly love, listen to him. This voice seems to be directed to the disciples, right? At the baptism, it's unclear who heard the voice. It might have just been Jesus who heard the voice at the baptism. But here, I think we're talking to the disciples, since we have this imperative. Listen to him. Suddenly, looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. So it's just this temporary glimpse of glorified Jesus, and then we go back to the story as a reminder. And honestly, I kind of wonder if that's what Jesus meant by this. Seeing God's kingdom arrive in power, and then 6 days later, they have this witness of Jesus' power. I think that's possible, that what Jesus meant. It's also possible that the author of Mark thought that, the end of times was sooner than it was. No way to know. But I think it might have meant this. So, questions that I can answer about the Transfiguration. That limits the questions. Not a lot of things I can answer about the Transfiguration. I've told you basically everything I know about the Transfiguration now. But, Bob?
I just find it interesting that the author wanted to add that in.
Mm-hmm.
He said this because he didn't know what to say.
He said that, Peter said this because he didn't know what to say. Yeah. It's one of those kind of things that make people believe the Mark got his information from Peter tradition, right? Because that does give it a sort of personal kind of feel when it says that. It's possible. There's no way to know. I mean, that tradition had to be strong because Mark wasn't a disciple, right? If you're gonna make up a gospel, then you pick a name everyone knows. You pick Matthew, you pick Thaddeus, you pick John. You pick a name that is a common disciple everyone knows. You don't pick Mark. There weren't any disciples named Mark. So how does a guy named Mark get his stuff into the Bible? He wasn't an apostle. Well, the tradition was so strong that he was connected to Peter that sort of pushed him across the finish line and the canonical decisions were made. And so I mean, the fact that tradition was so strong, I'm willing to believe it. I really just, because I don't have a better explanation for how a guy named Mark gets his stuff in there. Or Luke, frankly. I mean, if it wasn't for Luke's connection to Paul, I don't think we have Luke in the Bible either. You don't have to be an apostle, but you have to know one. It's always who you know. I mean, that's the way the world works, right? It's always who you know. Always been that way. Same way with the Bible. So, just that God was working through that. So, as they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them not to tell anyone what they'd seen until after the human one had risen from the dead. So they kept it to themselves, wondering, what is this rising from the dead? They asked Jesus, why do the legal experts say that Elijah must come first? He answered, Elijah does come first to restore all things. Why was it written that the human one would suffer many things and be rejected? In fact, I tell you, Elijah has come, but they did to him whatever they wanted, just as it was written about him. Basically, the disciples are asking about this tradition of Elijah's return. And this, by the way, comes from Malachi. The very last word in Malachi is about the voice crying in the wilderness, and Elijah was going to come. That's where the tradition comes, that Elijah will return before the Messiah. Well, Christians, well, I can say Jesus and Christians believe that prophecy was fulfilled in the person of John the Baptist. That John the Baptist, by his actions, by his challenging kings, by his being in the wilderness, by his odd dress and diet, was connected to Elijah sort of spiritually. He was sort of the spiritual fulfillment of the Elijah prophecy. And he got killed too. So So Elijah has come. He was killed just a couple chapters ago.
back.
He's returned. Well, Elijah didn't die.
Right.
He was assumed into heaven, yes. Taken up in a whirlwind, which is also another Hebrew word for tornado, which is not the way that the picture's ever depicted. He's blown into heaven in a tornado. It's always that gentle rising cloud,
So
you know.
Jews, Elijah still hasn't come yet.
Correct. This is why every Passover you always pour a drink and leave the door open for Elijah. It is a practice of saying, "Come, Messiah," to welcome Elijah in. Yeah, I think Saturday Night Live did a sketch where Elijah showed up at a Passover deal. So, yeah, and then Jesus showed up right after
It was on Saturday
at the
night,
end.
so they could get away with it.
They could get away. Well, Saturday it was after Sabbath, so I guess they get away with it. But yeah, they did. And then Jesus showed up at the very end of the sketch after that. It was a long time. I think it was in the 80s, or I think it was actually. Yeah. I don't know what connections you got to be to get away with that joke, but it worked. When Jesus, Peter, James, and John approached the other disciples, they saw a large crowd surrounding them and legal experts arguing with them. Suddenly, the whole crowd caught sight of Jesus. They ran to greet him, overcome with excitement. Jesus asked them, "What are you arguing about?" Someone from the crowd responded, "Teacher, I brought my son to you since he has a spirit that doesn't allow him to speak. Wherever it overpowers him, it throws him into a fit. He foams at the mouth, grinds his teeth, stiffens up. So I spoke to your disciples to see if they could throw it out, but they couldn't." So remember, the disciples have had some success doing healings and exorcisms before, but not this time. Jesus said, "You faithless generation, how long will I be with you? How long will I put up with you? Bring him to me." They brought him. When the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into a fit. He fell on the ground, rolled around, foaming at the mouth. Jesus asked his father, "How long has this been going on?" He said, "Since he was a child. It's often thrown him into fire or into water, trying to kill him. If you can do anything, help us. Show us compassion." Jesus said to him, "If you can do anything, all things are possible for the one who has faith." At that, the boy's father cried out, "I have faith. Help my lack of faith. I do believe. Help my unbelief." A beautiful phrase. And you can hear the desperation of a father asking this question in so many ways. I wouldn't have come here if I didn't believe a little. Help me get through and believe a lot. Noticing the crowd had surged together, Jesus spoke harshly to the unclean spirit. "Mute and deaf spirit, I command you to come out of him and never enter him again." After screaming and shaking the boy horribly, the spirit came out. The boy seemed to be dead. In fact, several people said that he had died. But Jesus took his hand, lifted him up, and he arose. After Jesus went into a house, his disciples asked him privately, "Why couldn't we throw this spirit out?" Jesus answered, throwing this kind of spirit out requires prayer. Y'all ain't praying. That's your problem. So, yeah. So it's going to get harder than it has been for you. You're going to require a higher level of commitment than you have had as we go forward. It's going to get harder. We see this building. Because remember, before when they went out, they didn't have to take anything because they could count on people welcoming them. And they could cast out spirits. Well, now, the spirits they're not able to cast out. And later on, people aren't going to welcome them. It's going to get hard to be a follower of Jesus. It's going to take more than you've been putting in before now as you go. You're going to have to grow as we go. Yeah. Questions? Yeah. It's going to get tough. Bob, you have something you'd like to say. I can just see it. This kind of spirit, yeah. I'm not about to start parsing the kinds of spirits. I'm not going to. I can't help you there. I will say that
Said it, they had some success.
they had some success.
This one they couldn't throw out.
This one didn't work.
Well, this was a tough one.
This is a tough one. You're not at that level yet.
You're not at that level yet.
Yeah. From there, Jesus and his followers went through Galilee, but he didn't want anybody to know. This was because he was teaching the disciples, the human one will be delivered into human hands. They will kill him. 3 days after he's killed, he will rise up. But they didn't understand this kind of talk, and they were afraid to ask. So
Yeah, they didn't want to be called.
they don't want to be called Satan again, exactly. So they can be taught. They can be taught. Takes them a bit, but they'll get there. Absolutely. So, you see,
I would never make it.
as a disciple of Jesus,
I just asked too many questions.
I don't think he minds the questions. I think he minds when you think you know the answer to the question you're asking. That was, that's where folks get into trouble. You know, the self-aggrandizing question, mirror, mirror on the wall sort of question, where you really want to know the answer. So, Jesus left that place and went beyond the Jordan to the region of Judea. So this means that he was on the east side of the Jordan River to go beyond the Jordan to Judea. So that's why I say Mount Hermon in that area over there, because that's beyond the Jordan. Crowds gathered around him again, and as usual, he taught them. Some Pharisees came and trying to test him, they said, "Does the law allow a man to divorce his wife?" Jesus answered, "What did Moses command you?" They said, "Moses allowed a man to write a divorce certificate and to divorce his wife." Jesus said to them, "He wrote this commandment for you because of your unyielding hearts. At the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Because of this, a man should leave his father and mother and be joined together with his wife, and the two will be one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, humans must not pull apart what God has put together." Inside the house, the disciples asked him again about this. He said, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if a wife divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery." The disciples were probably tracking up to here. Right up to verse 12, they were like, "Okay, yeah, I've heard other rabbis say this. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense." And then Jesus said, "If a wife divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery." This made no sense to them.
You can't divorce a husband back then, right?
You couldn't. No, well, that and a woman couldn't commit adultery because basically adultery was, and I hate to say it this way, but it's true, a property violation. Yeah. You slept with another man's wife. That's adultery. Right? The wife slept with another husband, another man, a wife slept with another man. That's adultery. But the idea that a wife could divorce her husband and marry another, she commits adultery. It is weird to say this is incredibly progressive, but this is incredibly progressive. I mean, the disciples would not have any idea how this would make sense. I mean, how does that even work? Because that's not what, they're not thinking in terms of faithful commitment in marriage, of a mutually submissive kind of marriage and partnership as you go through. They're thinking of the wife is basically easy to dismiss in this story. So I want to give Jesus credit for the progressive moment here in Mark. All of this interpretation, by the way, of the whole question of divorce, this is one that was going on at the time. People had debates about this. And it's all how you interpret Deuteronomy 24:1. Let's say a man marries a woman, but she isn't pleasing to him because he's discovered something inappropriate about her, so he writes up divorce papers, hands them to her, and sends her out of his house. So the rabbis want to know what something inappropriate is. What gives you a legitimate reason? What are the grounds for divorce on this? And it depends who you asked. So like for Jesus, he said, what did he say? Don't pull apart what God has put together. And whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, right? So you don't have, in this passage, you don't have any wiggle room about divorce. There's no grounds here. Matthew gives a little more wiggle room. Mark does not. This is the Mishnah Gittin. This is part of the oral law that I've talked about before, right? This is the rabbinic interpretation from around Jesus. Bet Shammai says a man should not divorce his wife unless he has found her guilty of some unseemly conduct. As it says, because he has found some unseemly thing in her. So in other words, Rabbi Shammai says that unless she's committed adultery, unless she's had moral infidelity, let's put it that way. Bet Hillel says that he may divorce her even if she has merely burnt his dish, since it says because he had found something unseemly in her. So Hillel says you can divorce her if she burns breakfast, because that's a reason. That's something that's not appropriate. You shouldn't burn breakfast, so that's totally cool. Rabbi Akiva says he may divorce her if he finds another woman more beautiful than she, as it says, it comes to pass if she finds no favor in her eyes. So they're all breaking down this whole thing here. Pleasing to him is favor in her eyes.
Sounds like they got different standards.
A lot of different standards is what makes...
This decision anymore. What's a bet, by the way?
A house. So in this case, the house of Shammai, and the rabbis that follow Shammai, the rabbis that follow Hillel, and the rabbis that follow, well, in this case, it's Rabbi Akiva. These are big named rabbis. Everybody knows
They
these.
spend months figuring out what to say.
These are actually contemporaries. Hillel and Shammai are contemporaries. Akiva is a little bit younger. He comes a little bit later. But yeah, so these are the two main ones. And Jesus tends to agree with Shammai, who tends to be the more conservative on this issue. Hillel, obviously, on this issue, fairly misogynistic, but nobody quite as big as Akiva here, who just doesn't like to be tied down, it would seem. And that's a reason. That's a reason. He says. Yes, this is very serious.
Yes, it says, he's referring to some other...
He's referring to Scripture right here. She isn't pleasing to him means that's a translation of finds no favor in his eyes. So let's say a man marries a woman, but she isn't pleasing to him. That
Because he's discovered something...
If she doesn't find favor in his eyes, he says that, okay, that means that you get out of jail on that one. You can go ahead and divorce on that one.
And where's this Mishnah?
The Mishnah Gittin is it is the oral interpretation. Remember we talked about the oral law?
Yeah.
This is the written down part when the oral law is written down. It's the Mishnah.
You want to read it more carefully?
Yeah, there's a lot, let me just say. Because what ends up happening is you get a verse, and then you get the commentary on the verse, and then you get the Talmud, which is the commentary on the commentary. This is a step before so it's Torah, Mishnah, Talmud.
Oh, I did, okay.
Yeah.
I
So-
didn't know there was another one.
Yeah, Torah is the law, Mishnah is the oral law, and the Talmud is the interpretation of the oral law.
What could the Talmud say about this then?
Most people dial it back closer to Shammai, I think, over time. Yeah, but always, I mean, yeah, Akiva had a couple of swings and misses on that, but
Mercy.
But they could get into 2 more months of unseemly conduct.
oh yeah. I mean, it's all the interpretation of this verse, and that's what the Pharisees are asking. How do you read this? And Jesus is saying, you only have this because you have an inappropriate understanding of marriage. You're not entering this understanding with a commitment to one another, and God is calling you to do this. And in many ways, Jesus' attitude is elevating the position of the woman in the marriage. This is a serious deal. 2 become one. It's not one who's picked up another. It is 2 who become one. And so you need to be very diligent about entering this, and not this whole, she burned breakfast or you saw someone cuter.
But not to agree with or defend it, but at least I see the logic in it.
Right.
You go back,
Yes,
he found something,
she isn't pleasing to him.
he discovered something inappropriate.
Right.
She's not as
Correct.
pleasing to me.
That's what Akiva is saying. Yes.
I thought she was the best, but I was wrong.
Right.
So
That is what Akiva is
she
saying.
is no longer appropriate to be my wife.
Correct.
She's not as pretty as that one.
That is what Akiva believes. I want to make sure and keep putting this in the mouth of Akiva and not be misunderstood to be agreeing with him in any way.
Nor
Yes.
is Bob saying this. I'm just
Correct.
trying to find where the
You see the logic in the application of this verse.
Yeah.
Yes.
Who is speaking? Okay, those are,
This is God to
who's speaking?
the people.
God is saying, let's
Yes.
sign it.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it doesn't.
It's part of
say
Torah.
something she
Well,
did.
actually, technically, it's Moses, but he's the prophet.
I
So.
kept wanting you to come back because I kept thinking it said because of something she did. That doesn't say anything she did.
No, inappropriate.
Just-
Oh, Deuteronomy, okay.
This is Deuteronomy. This is the Bible. This is the interpretation of the Bible.
Okay.
Okay? And remember what I said about Jewish interpretation. Our idea of interpretation is, what did Deuteronomy mean? And Jewish interpretation is, this is what Deuteronomy says. What has the community said that Deuteronomy means? And so it is the interpretation of the Bible for a Jewish interpreter is done in community. And it's done in community with ancient rabbis and modern rabbis and medieval rabbis, and everybody's talking about these things. And depending on the group you're in, it depends on which way you go with the interpretation. So some rabbis say you got to wait 6 hours after eating meat before you can have milk. Other rabbis say you can wait 3 and you're good. It just depends on the house.
Where did the adultery business come in? That was Mark.
This is Mark.
That's Mark.
Yeah. Just as Jesus speaking to his disciples, and he says, anybody who divorces and marries another, they commit adultery. And the disciples are going, okay, that makes some sense. And if a woman divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. That makes no sense, because the woman can't divorce, and how could she commit adultery?
But you have Jesus saying
This
that.
is Jesus saying this.
You have Moses saying
Moses says this.
this, and then you have
The rabbi saying this. Yes. Yes.
So Jesus is not talking about the written law at all.
He's talking about the intention of what marriage is in God's eyes. Yes. I mean, he really does have this beautiful progressive idea of a partnership, of a restored, beautiful partnership that each one has a responsibility of faithfulness to the other. And that would have blown their minds. Yeah. So, yeah. Anything else we want to talk? I figured we might want to talk about this when I showed you the rabbis. Yeah. Conservative rabbi and liberal rabbi and young. He's young at this. I don't know when he says this, but he's a little younger. Rabbi Akiva, though, is one of the reasons that we have Song of Songs in the Bible. I mean, if I just speak a word for Rabbi Akiva, if I can. We have Song of Songs in the Bible because at the Council of Jamnia in AD 90, that would be CE 90, So, 10 years before the year 100. That's a confusing number to say out loud. But in 90, he was at the Council of Jamnia, and everybody was like, really, it's awfully sexual. Do we really want to put Song of Songs in the Bible? A lot of sex in there. And Akiba said that if the Bible was the temple, then Song of Songs is the Holy of Holies, which makes him sound like a dirty old man. But actually, that his idea is that God's relationship to God's people is what is being portrayed in songs, not an expression of human love, but in fact an expression of God's love. And let me give you a moment of confession for me on this one. I was always happy to say, look, Song of Songs is probably Syrian love songs that have been appropriated. The Bible has taken them, they put them in, celebrating human love. It's a beautiful expression of what a man and woman and partner love can be, and I didn't have any idea. I mean, I've always pushed away the allegory. I always pushed away the God and his people or Christ and the church. I'm not a prude, but it was just a little, I don't know, it just seemed unseemly on some levels for that. It was too graphic. It really was. It was too graphic an expression. And I said this in class once. I still remember. I said this in class. I said, it's a traditional reading. The church read it this way, honestly, for 1900 years. It was really only as culture got more comfortable talking about sexuality that people began reading songs more secularly sexual and removing that interpretation away. And so I said that. I'm just more comfortable thinking of it as, wedding songs that celebrate love. And one of the students, and I wish I could remember his name. I could look it up and find him because I still remember him. He was sitting right there and he said, but Dr. Wallace, Hosea has God in a sexual relationship with Israel, with Gomer, and it's an adulterous one. And Ezekiel has God's relationship. So why are you comfortable with a dysfunctional sexual relationship, but you have a problem with a healthy sexual relationship? It's like, that is an excellent point. And I am going to have to go back and re-examine this. You're exactly right. Why am I okay depicting that, broken sexual relationship as God and the people, but I can't talk about a healthy sexual relationship between God and the people? So he called me out on that, and that was totally fair. And so ever since then, I've been much more sympathetic to Akiva's position and much better about reading it as allegory. I really have.
You're in a dysfunctional generation.
It was, absolutely. Yeah, well, I don't have problems acknowledging that. Gen X, what are we going to do?
That's pretty cool, Stu.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I always learn more from the students. I mean,
You must have gotten an A.
I did. He did.
That's why you're so smart. Because you taught for so long.
I did.
You keep learning from your
I keep learning from the students. 5,000 students that you pick up a thing or two. And they always love them. Yeah, that is one of those moments I will remember forever because it really called me out on a true level of I won't say hypocrisy, but a level of interpretation that really needed adjustment. And so, yeah. So Akiva's he picks it up after this. That's all I'm going to say. So anyway. As Jesus continued down the road, a man ran up, knelt before him, and said, "Good teacher, what must I do to obtain eternal life?" Jesus replied, "Why do you call me good? No one's good except the one God." So is Jesus saying Jesus is not good? I don't think so. I think what Jesus is saying is, are you confessing that I am God? You think I'm good. You think God, and God is good. You think I'm God? Is that what you're saying? He didn't elaborate, though. You know the commandments. Don't commit murder. Don't commit adultery. Don't steal. Don't give false testimony. Don't cheat. Honor your father and mother. Interesting that those commandments that Jesus lists, there are some that are missing. Any obvious?
All the first ones.
All the first four are missing.
Yeah.
Yeah. No other gods before me, graven images, misuse of God's name, Sabbath day.
Don't covet.
None of that's there. Well, I think, no covet's there, is it? No, covet's not in there. This is just the 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then for some reason, cheat maybe is covet. I don't know. It's standing in there. Who knows? But then the man says, "Teacher, I've kept all these since I was a boy." Doing pretty good on these. Not a problem. Okay, great. Jesus looked at him carefully and loved him and said, "You are lacking one thing. Go sell what you own and give the money to the poor. Then you will have treasure in heaven, and come follow me." But the man was dismayed at this statement and went away saddened because he had many possessions. So we understand maybe he did keep those last 6 commandments, but he had a problem with the first 4. that God was the thing that was his God. Money had become his God. He was trusting in his wealth, and that was what kept him from fully committing to God at this point. So,
How many times do we have a verse like that where Jesus, it says, and loved him?
loved him. Yeah, loved
Is that
him.
unique?
It's unusual. We do hear in John, Jesus loves Lazarus.
Right, okay, yes.
So that's one. And this
But Lazarus was like family.
they treated him like family, yeah.
Well,
And so I
whereas
think
this guy's a random person.
he is. He is.
And he loved, but I was talking about this with Paul at the retreat,
Oh yeah.
and I think that guy knew and was hoping that Jesus would
You
say
think so?
something else.
You think you want a different answer?
He was looking for a different answer,
Yeah.
and Jesus said, "You need to sell your stuff." It's like,
That's the.
I
I knew that's what he was going to
Say
say.
I can't.
Every rabbi tells me that. Yeah, it's a good question.
And I always read like the question before about the good teacher.
Good teacher.
Always like setting it up for, are you really gonna think I'm good after I tell
After I tell you the answer to your question.
right? And like setting it up to be like, but what I'm about to tell you is God.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
yeah.
There's no one good but God. So let's show that you're committed to God completely. Take away your safety net. Can't trust in the manna to come day by day. Trust that God will provide. Whew. And he went away sad because he had many possessions. Looking around, Jesus said to his disciples, it will be very hard for the wealthy to enter God's kingdom. Again, he's just broken their brains on the adultery issue. He just broke their brains here again. Because it is a simple formula that obviously you're wealthy because God blessed you. That's just the obvious answer.
People are still saying that today.
They do. Now, the prophets always came back with, no, you're wealthy because you put your thumb on the scale and you cheated the poor. That's why you're wealthy. So the prophets didn't necessarily buy into that whole you're wealthy because God blessed you. And Jesus is not buying into it either. You're not wealthy. I mean, the wealthy, whew, man, it's going to be hard, going to be tough. That's a tough one for the wealthy to get in. Doesn't say impossible, right? But it's hard. His words startled the disciples. So Jesus told them again, children, it's difficult to enter God's kingdom. It's easier for a camel to squeeze through the eye of a needle from a rich person to enter God's kingdom. So again, this one's literal, okay? I don't want to talk about the gate and the camel that gets on it. This one's a literal hyperbola that Jesus is using here. They were shocked even more and said, then who can be saved? And Jesus looked at them carefully and said, it's impossible with human beings, but not with God. All things are possible for God. So he gives them a possible statement, not a difficult statement, an impossible statement that shocked them even more and said, yeah, it's impossible for you, not for God. These things are possible with God. And Peter, wanting to remind them, look, we've left everything and followed you. Just wanted to get that on the record if I could. That's very important. And Jesus said, I assure you that anyone who has left house and brothers and sisters and mother and father or children or farms because of me and because of the good news will receive 100 times as much now in this life. Houses, brothers, sisters, mothers, children, farms with harassment. I don't know what that is. And in the coming age, eternal life. But many who were first will be last, and many who are last will be first. Notice that in this list again, no fathers. It is still interesting to me that fathers always had this negative image. And Jesus doesn't rehabilitate that image. It substitutes God. God is Father. You don't get new fathers. You get new mothers and brothers and sisters and God, Father. So it's fascinating. I wonder how much of that is an anti-imperial thing, because Caesar always considered himself father of the empire. He was the pater, he was the father of all and everyone. And so I wonder how much Jesus is using that image of God as Caesar as father of all and moving the focus to God as father of all. And that's why you don't get new fathers. But yeah.
But it's not saying that they're going to receive all of those things in this life.
In this
I'm
life.
reading,
100-fold as much now in this life and in the coming age.
it says they're going to get.
Yeah, you're going to houses, brothers, sisters, mothers, and children. I mean, I think the idea is found family now. For those of you who have left family that have rejected you, you now have found. Remember when Jesus and the family was trying to get in the door and he says, who are my brothers and sisters? But I think that is what this is you will find, that you are my sister, Nancy, and I'm your brother, and Bob is my brother, and Yeah, we're in one in the family of God now. I think that's what he's talking about. That the family has just overgrown. Yeah. So Jesus and his followers came to Jericho. I love this story. Jesus and his followers, you preached on this one, correct? Came to Jericho. As Jesus was leaving Jericho, why do we need to know they were going to Jericho? I love the fact that as Jesus was coming into Jericho, he then left. It was just, it was like he had nothing to do in Jericho whatsoever. Hey, let's go to Jericho. And as I was leaving...
Because if it started with as Jesus was leaving, then we'd say, well, what?
When did he get to Jericho? Right, exactly. Nothing happened in Jericho. He got to Jericho, and then he left Jericho. There was nothing to do in Jericho.
That removes the...
He used to go to Jericho all the time, then they changed chefs, and now there's no reason to go anymore. You just go right through Jericho. It's always funny to me. Together with his disciples and a sizable crowd and a blind beggar named Bartimaeus, the only gospel telling us his name. This is one of those nice parts where we get a little more detail here, like the grass was green and the beggar's name was Bartimaeus. Timaeus' son. Oh, that Bartimaeus. There have been so many, right? This just, I couldn't remember which the Timaeus' son. That's the, okay, sure, now I know. Was sitting beside the road. I love it when the Bible teaches us like we know the guy. You know, there's several places in the Old Testament where, like Huldah, the prophetess that told Josiah how to interpret the law, she was the one who married Harhus, the keeper of the king's wardrobe that lived in the second quarter in Jerusalem. You're like, oh, that Huldah. There have been so many Huldahs. I'm so glad you told me that. When he heard that Jesus was there, he began to shout, Jesus, son of David, show me mercy. Many scolded him, telling him to be quiet. But he shouted even louder, Son of David, show me mercy. So here's this one literally on the edge, literally on the margins, on the outskirts here. And people are trying to keep him there and keep him quiet. So keep the person on the edge quiet. And Jesus says, no, call him now to the middle. Place him in front. Mm-hmm.
Son of David, he's saying you're from the line of David.
It's a messianic claim.
Yeah.
Yeah, to call him son of David is to make a messianic claim. There's no question. Yeah. They called the blind man, good news, we should stop telling you to shut up. That's an awkward moment. They were telling him to be quiet. Bring him forward. Hey, good news. I shouldn't have told you to shut up. Be encouraged. Get up, he's calling you. Throwing his coat to the side, he jumped up and came to Jesus. Jesus asked him, what do you want me to do for you? The blind man said, Teacher, I want to see. Jesus said, go, your faith has healed you. At once he was able to see, and he began to follow Jesus on the way. Immediately, things happened quick in Mark, all the way through. Yeah, so happy story. If you'd like to know the ministry applications of this, I refer you to Meg's sermon on Sunday. So, but a great story. I think we're going to stop there. Yep, I think we're going to stop there. We'll do the triumphal entry next time. So,
It's made it nice to follow along because we've had so many of these passages recently.
We have.
In worship.
It has, yeah. We're getting to the part of the lectionary. Mark, we're in the year of Mark in the lectionary, and so we've been able to follow that along as we go. It's almost like it was on purpose. It's crazy. Yeah, yeah. Unfortunately, I'm going to do Matthew next, and Luke is coming, so I don't know what to do on that. That's okay. Any final questions before we go? All right. Well, have a great week. I will be teaching Trunk or Treat tomorrow night in the parking lot, 5:30 to 7:30. You can come and hand out candy from your car, or you can come and bring people to get candy. And hopefully my costume will be ready. We will see. So have a great week. 2 weeks.